China economic and geopolitical relationship is probably the singular most important bilateral relationship in the world. You could look at US-Europe and say it's on par, but in terms of two countries, nothing is, we're the only two superpowers in the world, albeit it's still at different scales, and we're the two great economic powers of the world. Our systems are very different. Our values are very different in so many ways. I think that the reality of where the two countries stand today is there's a growing sense of the two economies being delinked, and a growing sense of conflict growing in likelihood. My own view is that the world is not a safer place. China and the US are not a safer place if one gives in to the inevitability of that drift. Now, how do you manage that? I think you manage it by being very clear and tough about the things that you feel are most in your national interest. So questions of national security, whether it's geopolitical issues like freedom of movement on the seas, or technology issues like the ability of a potential adversary to go into your data systems in a way that could hurt you. You have to look at those issues and be clear-headed about them and tough where you need to be tough. I think what's going to change for sure is the tone of the conversation will change. You will not hear President Biden or any of the people who work for President Biden using ugly language to talk about other countries of the world that kind of, sound like racial slurs more than they sound like geopolitical positions. That's just not who he is. It's not who his team is. That ought not to be confused for weakness, because you may see more constancy of purpose. So you take an issue like human rights. I think that's a serious issue that this new administration will have to deal with. Forced labor in Xinjiang, what is and is not happening, in places like Hong Kong. Those issues are going to matter to the new administration. Fair trade, fair competition. There's not a lot of space for this administration to look the other way if there's either dumping or unfair subsidies or currency manipulation. The challenge is going to be, with all of those things, how do you then not be on the inevitable path towards conflict? Well, here's a few things that are already happening. Re-engagement in Paris. Paris was a place, Paris Climate Accord. Paris was a place where the US and China in the Obama years were working together. We can again work together. Re-engaging in the WHO. If you had said to me 5 years ago the United States might withdraw from the World Health Organization, it wouldn't have crossed anyone's mind. If you had said, does the World Health Organization need to be reformed? Of course, people would have said, yes, there's things we ought to do. Well, the goal of reforming things like the World Health Organization or the World Trade Organization are things where the US and China may well be able to engage in a conversation. Fundamentally, I think what's going to change is that the dynamic should not be US v. China, US v. China. The more the United States can work with our allies, with our European allies, our Asian allies, and work on an agenda where it's not China making concessions for the US, but China choosing whether it wants to be with the world of nations or not, I think the more successful we'll be. China's very pragmatic. I think with the US going it alone, it actually opened opportunities for China to move in and try to fill some of the space we left behind. I don't actually criticize China for that. If we abandoned, the stage, it was nature abhors a vacuum. I think that when you look at who most of the countries of the world would rather be allied with, look at the COVID vaccine. If we're not providing a COVID vaccine and China has one, the fact that ours is 95% effective and theirs is 50% effective actually doesn't matter, because the only one you can get is the 50% effective one. If the US is a reliable partner making a 95% effective vaccine more broadly available, I think we remain the driving force in the world. And that's not a hostile thing with China. It would be a good thing if China's vaccine program was part of a global effort and they were at 95% of the world. Because I think there's a lot of the world that is going to be looking for supply for some time. I'm just using that as an example of how it's not zero sum necessarily. On the direct issues where there's tension, I don't expect to see a switch thrown anytime soon where the US radically changes its approach. You heard most of the officials in their confirmation hearings take a very tough line on China. On the other hand, that doesn't mean they're not going to engage, and it doesn't mean that they're not going to find pathways to make progress on issues of common concern. And I hope that where decisions of the Trump administration were based on bad facts, bad reasoning, or wrong policy, they feel they have the room to make changes. But I don't think they can right out of the box come out and say X, Y, and Z will change. We are the two largest economies in the world. We are the two either superpowers or potential superpowers in the world today. So it is a unique relationship. I actually don't think most Americans are hostile to China or the Chinese people in any broad way. I think the language of the Trump administration was offensive to many. The idea that Asian Americans are subjected to hostile actions because of that rhetoric is something that has to change. I think what Americans have been increasingly concerned about with regard to China is that China has to play fair, and it hasn't. All the years that China was doing things with subsidies and through its currency practices was seen as hollowing out the American manufacturing economy. Some of that would have happened if China had played fair. The extent to which it happened was deeper and faster because they didn't play fair. And that's something that is going to have to be addressed as we go forward and look at how do we open markets to each other, how do we think about trade in the future. Americans have benefited from the U.S.-China trade in many ways. Whether it's the prices and quantities of goods that they've experienced, or the lack of conflict between our two countries, for much of the period of growing closer relations. But the kind of end of the WTO accession, China becoming a full player, is a sense in the United States that China took advantage of its status as a developing economy to use unfair tools in a way that hurt the U.S. economy. And we talk about those issues. When I was in government, we talked about those issues on a bilateral basis. I don't think it helps to turn it into, the way that President Trump turned the virus into the China virus. That's not the solution. That's not an excuse for totally mismanaging the pandemic domestically in the United States. So you have to kind of separate the issue. I mean, the reality is these Buy America practices have been in place for a very long time. And it's like the turn of the dial a little bit more than it is throwing a switch. So I think it's been carefully crafted to be consistent with our trade obligations. I don't view it so much as the way you describe it as kind of a return to policies that were in place. Some of the Buy America practices lead you to places that are a little absurd. I mean, there were Buy America provisions in the Recovery Act back in 2009, and it affected some of the infrastructure transactions between the United States and Canada. And we had a situation where Canada was paying for something, and we had a Buy America provision that said they had to use American products. And things like that don't make sense. But in government programs, I think they're not new. Let me just describe something that I think is different now than it was even when I was in a position of authority. One of the things the pandemic made clear was that there's the reliance on supply chains that may not be there when you need them really is a national security issue. It doesn't mean you have to do everything by yourself. But we've long accepted that in defense procurement, if you're potentially in a war, you have to be able to, with your own capacity and that of your closest allies, be able to meet all your needs. For some of the basic, if pandemic is a new reality and we have to deal with the risk of this recurring, at some point in the future, asking, can you respond quickly with your domestic capacity to produce the things you need to protect your population is a fair question. I don't think that's going to lead to all health equipment has to be domestically procured. But you want to have the capacity to ramp up when you need it, to take care of urgent national needs. One of the famous aphorisms about military strategy is that every army marches on its belly. If you can't feed the troops can't fight. So things like the supply of food, the supply of medicine, they are security issues. And I think that the move towards globalization happened so quickly, and it was managed so much by a private sector that was looking to drive down costs and maximize profits, that I don't know that anyone stepped back and asked the question, are we leaving a strategic gap there? And I think it's a good thing that question is being asked.